They caught him behind enemy lines, not in some Hollywood explosion or dramatic last stand, but in a quiet cascade of small failures, a missed radio signal, a bad navigation reading, an engine that sputtered and died over ground that wasn't on any friendly map. He should have been done, finished, another name added to the casualty lists. Instead, he escaped. He made it home. And within weeks of his return, he became a fighter ace. That sentence, captured, escaped, returned, ace, sounds clean, doesn't it? Almost too clean, like destiny, like fate had a plan all along. But here's what that sentence doesn't tell you. The farmers who hid him in their barns, the forged documents passed through prison walls, the bureaucrats who filed the wrong paperwork at exactly the right time, the quiet woman who handed him a stolen uniform and looked the other way. The real story isn't about destiny. It's about 1,000 tiny decisions, moments of impossible luck, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they had every reason not to. This is that story, the one beneath the headline, the ledger of debts, choices, and small acts of courage that turned a stranded pilot into a legend. Picture this. Early morning. The kind of dawn where you can't tell friend from foe because everyone's just a silhouette in the mist. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. His plane coughs. Not the sound of routine engine noise, the sound that means everything when you're alone over enemy territory. That mechanical stutter that changes your entire life in an instant. He lands short. Under cover he doesn't control. Movement outside the cockpit, loud, deliberate, closing in. The first officer to reach him doesn't bark dramatic orders like in the movies. He just asks simple questions. Who are you? Where are you from? And right there, the pilot learns his first lesson about survival. Don't perform. Don't be dramatic. Just answer the questions and stay alive. Because here's the thing most people don't understand about capture. It's not one terrible night. It's the beginning of something much longer. Capture starts with paperwork. Think about that for a second. You've just crash-landed in enemy territory. You're terrified, and the first thing that happens? Someone takes out a pen and starts filling out forms. Name, serial number, mission objective. Each detail gets stamped into a ledger, and with that stamp, you transform. You're not a pilot anymore. You're a case number, a line item, a problem to be processed. Days in custody don't unfold like an action movie. There's no constant torture, no daily interrogations. Instead, it's something arguably worse, routine. Roll calls, rations, the endless clack of boots on wooden floors. Small, repeated inconveniences designed to make you feel smaller every single day. But here's what they don't expect. Some prisoners learn to listen. They pick up the rhythms of patrol schedules. They memorize the names of careless guards. They notice which sentry yawns before shift change, who walks the perimeter lazily, where the rope on a guard's boot is starting to fray. Escape doesn't begin with a dramatic dash for freedom. It begins with paying attention. Before his capture, this pilot had something most people miss when they talk about heroes: practical training. Not just the glamorous stuff, dogfighting and aerobatics, but the unglamorous grit of fixing problems fast and moving on. The same discipline that taught him to adjust a carburetor at 20,000 feet taught him to smuggle a compass under his boot sole. The muscle memory of reading instruments in the cockpit became the muscle memory of reading people in captivity. But training alone doesn't create escape. What really mattered were the quieter things. His capacity for patient planning, his distrust of empty rhetoric, his practical kindness to people below his rank. Because wars aren't just battles, they're networks. And survival means building fragile alliances with strangers who cross every border of language, politics, and motive. Here's the truth about escape that nobody tells you. It's rarely heroic spectacle. It's tiny opportunities stitched together with patience and precision. A guard forgets to lock a gate during a rainstorm because he wants to get dry. A clerk misfiles a report under the wrong category. A sympathetic soldier slips a piece of bread to a hungry prisoner. Each tiny human mistake carries weight. Each small glitch in the system creates an opening. So the pilot watches. He practices walking silently in his cell's shadow, calibrating every sound, the scrape of canvas, the soft click of a latch. He keeps a fragment of wire that might become a lockpick. He trades favors. He learns the guard's schedule and holds those facts like tinder, waiting for the spark. When the moment finally comes, it's not one long heroic dash. It's a carefully planned series of small, survivable steps. A stolen uniform from a laundry pile, a false document whispered through a hole in a wall, the patient crossing of a field that smells once again of damp earth and risk. Moving at dusk, resting by day, using silence like armor. And here's where the story gets complicated, because escape isn't a solo act. The farmer who fed him boiled roots, he had a friend who once vouched for a stranger and paid the price. The teacher who hid him in her attic, she counted the nights of danger against the single act of kindness. The partisan who guided him across a river, he demanded payment not in currency, but in promises. Remember my name, carry this message, tell people what happened here. These aren't debts you can repay with a handshake and a thank you. These are obligations that bind you to strangers who once held your life in their hands, debts that will follow you for the rest of your days. When he finally crossed into friendly territory, the relief was real, but it was complicated, because returned prisoners don't just step back into their old lives. Armies are suspicious. They have to be. Protocol demands debriefings, security checks, verification of identity. Every single detail gets cross-examined. The pilot who had been a hero on paper now faced officers trained to doubt. Each verification stung because it implied possible betrayal. He answered forms, sat for medical exams, allowed his hands to be photographed and cross-checked against old records. Being reintegrated is its own kind of limbo. You're cleared to fly, maybe, but you still have to prove your loyalty all over again. And the squadron? They assumed he was dead. They'd moved on. His return destabilized everything. Some commanders feared security breaches. Some pilots whispered suspicions they wouldn't say out loud. Trust had to be rebuilt mission by mission, landing by landing. One precise sortie at dawn said more than 1,000 words ever could. Getting back into a cockpit after captivity isn't just technical, it's psychological warfare with yourself. For some pilots, the plane becomes therapy, a place where muscle memory erases the haunting sequences of interrogation. The instruments are objective, the physics are reliable, the sky doesn't lie. For others, it becomes something else, a theater of revenge or a space to prove innocence. He arrived with a new focus, not recklessness, not chasing glory, just survival, and honoring the people who'd helped him by making sure their risks weren't wasted. But survival requires engagement. Missions require risk. So the first flights became tests. Did his reflexes still work under G-forces? Did he answer radio calls crisply? Did his hands betray him at critical moments? The first real engagement after his return felt different. It wasn't emotional, it was technical, a living geometry problem. The enemy's silhouette appeared, angle of attack, closure rate, wind speed. He watched comprehensively, not emotionally. Years of training and the sharpening stress of survival had tuned his senses to a razor's edge. He made choices based on probabilities, a maneuver that worked in practice, a move of a high chance of success, even if it felt morally ambiguous. Because that's the truth about air combat that nobody likes to admit. Moral clarity and practical calculation don't always align. You do what works, you survive, you count the cost later. 5 confirmed kills. That's the number that makes you an ace. That's the metric that gets you into the history books. But here's what the number doesn't show: whose life was taken, under what circumstances, with what necessity. Each claim carried weight beyond the tally. And becoming an ace is as much administrative as it is combat-related. Witness reports, gun camera frames, encrypted logs, comrades corroborate, leaders approve. Paperwork converts action into recognition. Each line in that ledger made him an asset, safer in terms of supply priority, replacement aircraft, better assignments. But it also made him visible, and visibility in war cuts both ways. It can shield you, it can also paint a target on your back. What the medals never capture are the strings attached to survival, the web of people he owed, the farmer, the teacher, the partisan, the officer who glanced the other way. Some debts were explicit promises, others were silent expectations. The list of gratitude lengthened with every mission he survived, names to remember, families to send aid to, secrets to keep where speech would endanger lives. Surviving in war is social as much as physical. The network that preserves you often costs others dearly. There's a peculiar silence that follows public recognition. You get parades, mentions in dispatches, a moment in the light. Then you return to the afterlife of duty and memory. The public sees the headline, daring escape, string of victories, decorated hero, clean, simple, inspiring. But inside, the pilot carries a different ledger. The moral compromises of asking for favors, the quiet acts of reciprocity to repay risk, the memory of nights spent listening for footsteps, trying to stay invisible. The public claps, the pilot bows, but his inner accounting follows different math. The psychological adjustments aren't just private, they change flight performance itself. Some returning pilots become sharper, more deliberate, products of learned hypervigilance. Others narrow their tactics to what feels safe, a certain banking angle, a preferred altitude, a trusted wingman. He developed an economy of movement designed to maximize chance and minimize surprise, not aggression for its own sake, but risk-managed precision. Because aces don't succeed through bravado, they succeed through timing. They put the nose at the exact angle to cut a turn. They watch the enemy's control surfaces. They exploit human reaction times. Beneath the tactics is a mindset. Each engagement is a problem to be solved, not a stage to be performed. Flight becomes a sequence of probabilistic decisions. That's the quiet part myth always misses. The ace predicts outcomes, hedges bets, and accepts the cost of uncertainty. Loss follows success because each engagement raises the stakes. Comrades fall, sometimes ones whose faces you recognize from the mess hall, whose jokes you remember, whose families you met on leave. The grief accumulates, and the ace, even as he climbs in reputation, lives with an inversely proportional solitude. Commanders ask more of him, enemies try to eliminate him. The people who rescued him remain in the background, often unrewarded and unnamed. He learns to navigate this isolation through ritual, letters kept but unread, small acts of service to the squadron, making sure the next man gets the chance he once had. Later, the official records show the numbers, sorties flown, confirmed victories, decorations awarded. They tell a neat story. Historians love them. But the human story resists tidy accounting. For him, the important ledger was different, the list of names he could not forget, the ones who had risked their lives for a stranger's safety. Those obligations shaped him as much as the medals. He found ways to repay, not always in money, but in testimony, in advocacy, in clandestine aid where possible. The arc from captivity to ace isn't just a linear hero's tale, it's a long contract of reciprocity. When the war's noise faded into distant memory, the pilot faced the civilian world, and the transition was brutal. Some men found work in civil aviation, others took quiet jobs far from anything that reminded them of the sky. Some could never escape the smell of fuel and compression. Recognition complicated everything. A medal doesn't automatically reweave the threads of community. It doesn't erase what you've seen or what you've done. The skills that kept him alive, calculating risk, managing people under pressure, reading subtle signals, became assets in reconstruction. But they also left him someone who thought of life in contingency rather than certainty. There are other debts, too, to memory and to history. He knew that stories of escape and victory could be sanitized, turned into propaganda, stripped of the messy, complicated truth. He wanted more than glory. He wanted truth. Truth about the people who helped him and the cost that survival extracted. So in later years, he resisted myth-making. He insisted that the story include the nameless farmers, the bureaucratic glitches, the small acts that had been instrumental. He wanted the ledger, not just the headline. Here's the cautionary point about how we understand heroism. Ethical praise must include context. A man who returns and wins battles is laudable for skill, but the context in which he returned involved others' risk, others' sacrifice. When we tell his story, we can't isolate the heroic gesture from the social web that enabled it. Heroes rarely rise alone. They climb on the backs of choices made by others, often anonymously. There are technical moments worth remembering because they show how small decisions compound into survival. In one engagement, his timing was off by a fraction of a second, and only a wingman's correction saved him. In another, a hurried recalibration of his gun sight made the decisive difference. These aren't cinematic miracles, they're mundane adjustments, but they're what survival actually looks like, the sum of minor corrections made at speed, each based on prior practice and quiet counsel from companions. Military papers don't just certify heroism, they regulate reintegration, promotion, resource allocation. A decorated man receives better aircraft, priority for maintenance, staff support. That bureaucratic attention is itself a kind of protection. It changes how you fly because it alters your options and your obligations. He learned to navigate both the cockpit and the office corridors where decisions were made about where to deploy skill and who to protect. The moral texture of this story is messy. He felt guilt for living and relief at surviving. Those tween feelings coexisted uneasily. He mourned comrades, but continued to fly. He felt indebted to civilians, yet frustrated by political structures that later ignored many who had helped. That friction informed his post-war life. He became an advocate, quietly lobbying for recognition of those who had risked their lives for others. He used the access his medals granted to speak for names that would otherwise vanish in archives. Toward the end of his active service, he looked differently at victory. The tally had been a tool, a way to organize effort and encourage morale, but he came to measure effectiveness by different criteria. How many men did he bring home? How many missions avoided unnecessary risk because of a wiser decision? How many favors were repaid to those who had sheltered him? These unglamorous metrics mattered more than headlines. When the fighting stopped, public memory condensed him into images, a smiling photograph in uniform, a medal on a chest, a short interview praising duty. Those images are fine for history books, but they simplify. The fuller record, the ledger, is less tidy. Names in margins, small notes about debts, places where forms had been filed to secure aid. He kept a private list in notebooks and letters, and as long as he could, he tried to act on it. What remains instructive about this arc isn't just that a man became an ace against the odds, though that is remarkable. The lesson is methodological. Survival and later success were produced through networks, procedure, moral complexity, and ordinary acts repeated with determination. The headline compresses, the ledger unpacks. If we want to understand what makes a person resilient in war, we must study both. The story closes not on a final dogfight, but on the quieter arithmetic of responsibility. He lived with the knowledge that methods outlast men. The practices that saved him could be used for good or for ill. Bureaucracy could shelter life or rationalize harm. Communities could shelter strangers or exploit them. Recognizing that duality matters. When you think of that captured pilot, remember the texture of his days. The smell of oil and cold metal at dawn, the hush of a refugee hut where he slept for a night, the stamped ledger where a clerk wrote his number, the soft voice of a woman who gave him a cloak. Those ordinary things, forms, favors, roots, add up. They produce outcomes history either glorifies or forgets. He became an ace, yes, but becoming an ace was just a chapter in a longer story, a story about the social and administrative architecture of survival in wartime. If there's single thing to carry forward, it's this: attention to the small instruments of life. The paper, the promise, the quiet kindness matters as much as the thunderous acts. That's how ordinary people, and sometimes extraordinary ones, endure. When the war receded and the medals glinted less often, he returned to a quieter life with a ledger in his mind. He kept the names and the debts. He worked to honor them with the tools the world had given him.
testimony, aid, and a refusal to let their sacrifices become mere footnotes. In that way, his survival propagated beyond himself. It tied him forever to the small, persistent acts that make mercy possible. And so the last image is not of smoke and tracer fire, but a simple entry in a worn notebook, a name, a village, a sentence, helped by a man who once flew for his country. That line is the real record. It's not the one historians always prefer, but it's the one that matters.